As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me, us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect. And joining me today, I have a guest. This has been a long time coming, but I'm so excited that we're finally getting this done. Welcome to the first time to The Malcolm Effect, Professor Gary Wilder. How are you?
I'm good. It was terrific to meet you at Cornell, you and some of your peers. So I'm very excited to follow up on that conversation or to have this head wherever we want, wherever it goes. I'm good.
I mean, definitely that encounter was actually quite inspirational, and a lot of what you said has been kind of ruminating in my mind, to which I want to speak to today. So, my first question is, in thinking through our current juncture, the right are growing steadily. Fascistic dialogue is accepted under the rubric of freedom of speech. The left seem divided. In your assessment, what the hell is going on, and what is the state of US politics today?
Huh. I am certainly not an expert in US politics today, but it does seem that a few things are going on. The right is triumphing on the one hand. I mean, we are definitely heading into some extremely dark times on every front. And I think we have to take that extremely seriously. And these kind of scholarly conversations about, well, the conditions are very different than they were in Germany in the 1930s. Therefore, this is overblown. I think this is a very serious situation. I think we have to take seriously right wing calls for civil war, they've got the guns and we don't. They've got the story and they don't. They've got the hearts and mind of the people and we don't. On the other hand, even, if on the one hand we have seen a kind of very powerful consolidation of a hegemonic project. At the same time, this is also a kind of a hegemonic crisis. So there's also an opportunity here in the sense that the fabric that has held the neoliberal consensus together, all the institutional power is still there, and there's still a lot of ideological support across classes and across political positions and across ideological convictions and just kind of common sense attitudes. On the other hand, there seems to be a kind of general sense that this is not working. There's a lot of discontent. There's a lot of unraveling. There's a lot of retrenchment. Whenever we see this kind of violence, it suggests, or the kind of turn to violence, it suggests, a kind of hegemonic project in decline and in crisis. So I think there's also a lot of openness in terms of, again, the kind of norms and the assumptions and the promises are unraveling a bit. So this is the time to organize. This is the time to kind of act. This is the time to take all of this seriously and to realize that the right has been taking lessons from the left in a certain way, and we need to reclaim the upper hand in terms of mass organizing, a vision of a different kind of world, and a compelling story to tell people.
Thank you so much for that answer. I really appreciate it. Your book, Concrete Utopianism, I read as a book of hope in a time where pessimism persists and permeates. But thinking about the left and some of the kind of people who have gained prominence today and assessing our current order, oftentimes these thinkers make ontological claims. They posit the current order as insurmountable. So my first question is, why do you think there seems to be, in this moment, a focus on the ontological?
Yeah, that's a great question because that focus on the ontological is, we can see it in Afro-pessimism, we can see it in certain varieties of poststructuralism, we can see it in the different varieties of posthumanism, we can see it in fact, some of the conversations about the Anthropocene, it's in a lot of different places. In some ways, even gender and sexuality issues are kind of moving to that ground. I think it's always in a certain way when the situation is dire, when every attempt to move forward seems to reproduce the conditions of the predicament that you're trying to get out of. When confronted with deep sense of systemic domination or systemic predicament, it's very hard to hold on to kind of Marxian dialectical thinking and to recognize that social orders are contradictory and that there are possibilities for dialectical reversals, and that if we're going to go forward, we have to go through the given mess that we're in all kinds of ways. And I think in response to a social order that seems closed, where domination seems total, where everything seems to be stuck and fixed, there's, I think, a kind of appealing tendency to look for an ontological standpoint of critique, an ontological perspective or ground or terrain from which to confront the given order, as if there's some kind of more pure, less tainted, more solid, more reliable, more foundational way of thinking and way of acting that will somehow solve the problems. But we can only solve the stuff politically and in a messy way by working through the given. That's part of the answer. Another part of a longer answer would have to do with the way in which critical thinking, at least in the Western Academy, or at least in the Anglo American Academy, or maybe in the American Academy, for post 60s, let's say, we have seen a kind of decline in Marxism among thinkers. We have seen a kind of important emphasis on the politics of difference. But this has led us in a lot of ways to the assumption that the only and kind of self evident form of criticism and standpoint of criticism is to criticize universality from the standpoint of particularism. And I think that leads us into this focus on, an ontological focus on difference, and that is that's the beginning of a conversation about why this shift. I mean, there was a very important kind of movement in a whole range of critical fields that attuned us to the intrinsic relationship between epistemology and domination, between forms of power and forms of knowledge, between, this attention to epistemic violence, which is extremely important. But somehow the important move of folding that into our Marxian understandings or our critique of the given or a project to organize for a different kind of world has led a lot of thinkers and students and generations to kind of be more focused on, or excessively focused on, kind of the origins of ideas, on epistemological purity, on producing boundaries between ways of thinking and ways of being that are somehow unsurpassable. And yeah, we get a kind of civilizational thinking. I think this ontological tendency is linked to a kind of civilizational thinking that goes against the kind of, I think, Marxism and internationalism and anti-imperial internationalism and kind of Black critical tradition that we most need right now.
Thank you so much for that answer. And you hit some of the buzzwords of epistemology, dominance, and power. And this leads on to my next question. When we met, you mentioned that you were from, amongst the nascent generations that were recipients of an education where Marxism was disavowed. And so my question is, what is it? What was it then and what is it now? The appeal of so many of these French theorists, and how do you think it affected your generation of intellectuals?
Yeah, good question. And of course, it's important to distinguish between the academic left and the social movement left. And you're asking about theory, and I'll answer, and education and epistemology and pedagogy. So I'll answer on those terms, but, note that I am not, we shouldn't read from this story or any story about this, shouldn't project from that onto, the left in general. A few things happened. Of course, I came up in the 1980s in college, 82 to 86, and then I was in graduate school in the 90s, and this was kind of the post 60s moment in several ways. the neoliberal project was consolidating. Part of that was a brutal, worldwide, unrelenting destruction of the left, of left movements, of left politics, of left possibilities, both in the metropole and, in the US and in the centers and through what we now call the global south. It was not called the global south then. It was still third world as far as I know. So there was a neoliberal attack on the left. There was also a sense in that post 68 moment that the traditional left parties and trade unions didn't step up and could not give a kind of couldn't understand the situation that was unfolding, couldn't understand these anti-systemic movements that were working all over the place. And a whole generation was very frustrated with the old left, which is why we talk about the new left. And part of that new left was the rise of a whole set of social movements, feminism, anti-racism. There'd always been a strong anti-racism movement, but third world liberation, third worldism were all folded into this kind of big tent of new leftism. And there was increasingly a kind of attention to consciousness, culture, identity, subjectivity, lived experience, positionality, which were all important ways to critique, I think, traditional Marxism and traditional, socialist movements and the labor movement. At the same time, there was a kind of deep rejection of vanguardism in any form. But part of the problem is that any kind of a lot of just like organization, leadership, vision of programs were understood to were all thrown under the rubric of vanguardism. And we get this kind of equivalence between leadership and vision on the one and organization on the one hand, and somehow the imposition of a small elite or privileged group's norms on an unsuspecting or uninterested people, whether it's within your own society or somewhere else. And basically, there was this fear of, again, leadership and vision that would, let me put it this way, the long history, and it is a real history, of the ways in which left thinking and left movements were elitist and were hierarchical and bureaucratic and did impose norms on heterogeneous groups of activists, did say things like, look, let's work out the kind of socialist revolution and we can worry about race or gender later. I mean, there are real reasons to kind of be concerned about this, but this led to a kind of, both in theory and a lot of practice, a kind of decline of Marxist thinking and of a kind of concern among academics and scholars with social movements. And this, a kind of libertarian, a libertarian leftism started to emerge that we can associate, just for shorthand's sake, with Michel Foucault, for example, who was offered a lot of excitement to people because he was a critical left thinker who gave us a way to talk about so many of these forms of domination, but who also renounced the very project of societal transformation, rejected a kind of Marxian account of why these oppressive norms and normalizing practices existed. And at the same time, what we started to get was a very caricatured notion of Marxism, a notion that Marxism is a theory by Europeans, for Europeans, and for the West, but also a caricatured notion of Marxism that disregarded the generations of Marxists who tried to open Marxism up or offer more open readings of Marx to show us that neither Marx nor the Marxian tradition is economistic, deterministic, teleological, class reductive, class essentialist. But all of these criticisms of Marxism, and this continues today, give us a very caricatured, one-dimensional version of Marxism that's very easy to dismiss and say, you see, this can't deal with any of these problems. But I'm interested in those thinkers, whether Western Marxist or Black Marxists or Third World Marxists, who worked to kind of fold those insights about difference, about culture, about consciousness, about the international, about the global into a Marxian analysis. I don't know if that helps at all.
So speaking about the thinkers, the Black radical tradition, the Black critical tradition that has opened up Marxism to show that, that Marxism dialectical thinking can understand the race, can understand issues of gender. But thinking about, let's say, the book Black Marxism and Cedric Robinson, when I'm sat in classes reading that book, and I've read that book a few times in class and amongst friends, and when I see people who read that book coming away from that book, it seems to orient them in the disavowal of Marxism and with the same. Are they misreading the book in your opinion, or is it that that book does orient you to kind of say Marxism is inadequate?
Sacred text, and it is an extremely important book for many, many reasons. But let's just take two for the moment, which is to put the concept and the issue and the question of racial capitalism on the table, which reminds us that there's a kind of there's always been an intrinsic relationship between racialization and capital accumulation, and to ask a whole set of questions about what that relationship is, how it works differently at different times and places, what we get by framing it this way versus that way. So it's very extremely generative, and also it's an extremely important book for bringing our attention to the Black radical tradition. These were not these terms did not have the currency they have now until this, second edition came out, and there was a kind of happy convergence between powerful, brilliant thinkers like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Robin D.G. Kelly, and this moment in kind of American politics and Black studies, and a lot of things came together to make that exciting. But so many people read the book and either I think, get a distorted notion of Marxism, or are looking for the Marxism that isn't quite there. And I think, we need to ask questions about Robinson's. He offers a slightly caricatured version of Marxism. And when you do that, then Marxism is not capable of dealing with the kind of nationalism he's talking about, or the racialism he's talking about, or the Black radical tradition, which he kind of understands in a kind of transhistorical nationalist terms. So, both in terms of racial capitalism, this very important insight about the intrinsic relationship between racialization and capital accumulation leads him to, or instead, we get a story about racialism being the deep cultural logic of Western civilization. Now, there's something to that. There's something extremely interesting and innovative and important to say, hey, look, this stuff doesn't just come out of nowhere. And these modes of differential thinking go way, way back and don't just start with slavery. But I think it's also deeply unsatisfying and problematic to kind of make this kind of culturalist argument that this is the deep structural logic of the Western worldview that just, that kind of loses that specificity of the articulation between Atlantic slavery and anti-Black racialization, which is so important. And similarly, when he talks about the Black radical tradition, and I think it's extremely important to say, look, Marxism and socialism are not the only revolutionary traditions. There is a kind of organic, indigenous, autonomous, independent, transgenerational Black radical tradition, a revolutionary tradition where people were not thinking about Marxism or socialism at all. And yet there was this kind of deep, enduring, insurrectionary will towards freedom and liberation. But he goes from there to say, and it was propelled by a metaphysical need or desire or insistence on reproducing the ontological totality of African societies. I just don't. Of course, enslaved people didn't come with nothing, and they also did come with all kinds of political sensibilities and traditions, modes of self-management and self-care, and reciprocity, and these were woven into that. But I think I don't someone like CLR James gives us a notion of a political tradition rather than a cultural tradition in certain ways. And then his readings of Du Bois and James, for example, are very peculiar because they tell this same story about a kind of meta narrative, a movement from liberalism to Western Marxism to disenchantment with Western Marxism because it could not address race or non Western situations, and then their discovery of the Black radical tradition, which he treats as the kind of apex and punchline for both Du Bois and James. But these were books that each of them wrote in 1938 and 1936, respectively, or 35, 36. One was Black Reconstruction. And they both went on to do much more work that folded all of those insights into a Marxism that they never disavowed. So there's an ambivalence. At the end of that book, Robinson says, look, I want a kind of Black Marxist synthesis. On the other hand, he repeats over and over and certainly conveys the idea that this kind of Marxism that for him is fundamentally about the economy and not about a kind of society, and fundamentally about a kind of theory of history or a story about history, can't accommodate that which he's interested in. And I think the kind of opening he offers gets shut down a little too quickly, and it leaves people looking for alternatives rather than to say, let's reread Marx so that we can see his understanding that capitalism is a global formation and that imperialism and capitalism are bound up with each other. And let's read this whole tradition of Black Marxists, anti imperial Marxists, or theorists of uneven development who show us that a Marxian reading of capitalism helps us see how capitalism always requires and reproduces differences, including racial differences. It doesn't necessarily depend on anti-blackness, although that's an arguable position. But I think that's a very so. I can keep going, but I'll stop and just say, like, the book is extremely important for shifting the terrain of conversation, for opening these questions. But I think, in a certain way, part of the we need to have the conversations about the doors that are open and closed, rather than to just reverentially cite a kind of complex book that has a lot of moving parts and is kind of its time and has some inconsistencies and I think some dubious claims.
Thank you so much for that answer. So then I'm going to put it to you as an academic and as an instructor and someone who teaches then. Given our current moment and thinking about, okay, I had on this podcast recently a professor called Radhika Desai, and she says, post-structuralism has run its course, which I'm in totally agreement with her. But my question to you then is, in thinking about our current moment, organizing, and in the kind of Lenin question, what is to be done, what would you advise the younger generation or those thinkers coming up at the moment to return to, or what is it that we should be doing?
What should we doing in general, or how do we use more? What do you mean return to?
So is it like a return back to Marx? Is it a return back dialectical materialism? Or is it like we have to, okay, think of new ways to, I mean, of course, we're going to think of new ways and new imaginaries, of course. But I'm thinking about, is it that we just disavow post-structuralism in totally now? It's run its course, it's no longer of use to us? Or is it that, yeah, that's kind of my question.
Yeah. Well, look, the most important thing to do is to organize. The only way anything will change, and we can see this by looking at the right, is through mass movements, direct action, combined with powerful accounts of that which people should be struggling for, and to be operating on all fronts, which is what the right has also been doing and what we need to be doing. We need to be, working at neighborhood levels. We need to be working at electoral levels. We need to be certainly working on ideological levels. Stuart Hall used Gramsci to talk about the ideological class struggle. So politics, economics, and ideology were his three spheres and terms, or Lenin's or agitation, propaganda, organization. All of that is extremely useful. Does one have to read Marx or be a Marxist to do that? Absolutely not, in terms of movements. But insofar as we are thinkers and intellectuals, and there is a relationship between theory and practice, I think it's very useful to remember long histories of struggle, that these are traditions that, what seem to be failures also educate new generations of activists and raise political consciousness and offer political education. And the more, even, when things feel like we keep hitting dead ends. It's only through this kind of ongoing movement work and organizing that when a certain kind of opportunity or a critical situation starts to unfold, people have the habits and the skills and the infrastructure to act in a meaningful way. But to step back for a second, as scholars, as thinkers, as anti-capitalists and anti-imperialists, I think both Marx's writing and the Marxist tradition give us, including the Black Marxist tradition, give us powerful tools for understanding what we're up against. For example, Marx helps us understand this relationship between reason and unfreedom. Marx helps us to understand indirect and invisible sources of domination. He helps us to understand, and the Marxian analysis of imperialism, for example, or uneven development, helps us to understand that capitalism is a worldwide formation. As I said before, capitalism requires and reproduces differences. So there can't be Black liberation or the abolition of racism as long as capitalism continues to exist. But the opposite is also true. We can never have socialism as long as we, kind of allow the social order to be racially organized and society to be a racial formation. Marx offers us dialectical thinking and immanent critique, which is extremely interesting. That which seems to, he invites us to look at the relations between seemingly disparate processes or entities. He helps us to see that social processes are, especially under capitalism, are contradictory and crisis ridden, which means that there is always the possibility of dialectical reversals, that the given order is always creating kind of conditions or openings or possibilities that point beyond itself. Now that has to be, fought for, organized. The moment has to be seized. You both need long-term processes of a kind of Gramscian 50-year project of, organizing hegemony, and you need to kind of seize the moment in that Leninist fashion. But Marxism, dialectical thinking, and immanent critique help us to understand actual pathways between what seem to the ontological thinkers to be a totally static, stuck present and this kind of unimaginable other world. Then we get into apocalypse, apocalyptic thinking, metaphysical thinking, end of the worldism in a certain way. So Marx gives us that, which I could say more about. But I'll just say one more thing that Marx and the Marxian tradition, which is linked to the anti-imperial tradition and a kind of Black critical tradition, he gives us internationalism. The first international that he co-created in 1864 was problematic and limited and was really about the European proletariat, not the world proletariat. But this notion of internationalism, this notion that there may be that a distant struggle is not separate from your struggle. And you don't only support that struggle because it's morally correct or that you are committed to social justice, but that in an interdependent and interconnected world, when faced with a worldwide form of domination, we have to, as Lenin said, transform the imperial war into a civil war. And in this case, a global civil war. So Marx's internationalism not only gives us a way of thinking, the first international, problematic as it is, doesn't only give us a way of kind of a powerful precedent for understanding that working people everywhere in a certain way need to be aligned with each other, need to be support each other, and need to kind of and can compose a kind of a different kind of political subject that can change the world. And you need an organizational form for this kind of internationalism. It's not an individual thing. It's not just individual sympathy. And it can't, it can be issue based, but I think we have lost something there, which is why in my book, I talk about Samir Amin's looking back to the first international, not to reproduce it, but to create a new internationalism of peoples, a new fifth internationalism he calls for, which is about a sensibility, but also about an infrastructure. Of course, as Marxists, we're interested in dialectical thinking and immanent critique and the way in which, actually existing processes may create conditions or possibilities for things to be otherwise, and we can't change the world the way utopian socialists once imagined by just kind of speculating about a perfect kind of society. But I do think part of what we have lost in this post-political, post-structuralist, neoliberal, I don't know, moment is the habit of political imagination, the habit of envisioning a different kind of world, both for our own sake. Well, how do we reverse engineer that? But also in terms of the ideological class struggle, we cannot continue to meet a vision of the far right with facts and figures about single payer healthcare or budgetary issues. That's fine. That's important. But technocracy and policy can't be the only arm of the left. And our fear of predicting a future or programming a future in a way that may turn out not to comport with what everyone wants, that runs the risk of a minority, whether it's a Bolshevik party or a Western socialist movement imposing its norms everywhere else. We always have to worry about that and be aware of that. But I think it's also important not to mistake vision with blueprint. We understandably fear blueprints. How can you tell people how it's supposed to be? How can you predict the future? Isn't that dangerous? Isn't that problematic? Where do you get off doing that? You're imposing your partial or parochial norms. They're false universalisms. All of those are dangerous things. But I think to give up vision has been very, very costly for the left.
Absolutely. And I like the way you put it in concrete utopianism. I believe you temporal provincialism.
Mm,
I really like that term. I thought, yeah, I think exactly what we're suffering from right now. And again, that could be a lasting remnant of identity politics of the bad kind.
yeah.
So I do want to return back to the ontological,
Okay.
because in thinking about German ideology, Marx does posit an ontology. I think to say that Marxism hasn't got an ontology is incorrect. Clearly, for Marxism, he does believe that our ontology is intrinsically linked to relations of production. But he does have an ontology of what it means to be a human, because for him, the kind of actualization of one's humanity is through a freedom from oppression and exploitation and domination. In your understanding, then, is it that we should return and put forward also Marx's ontology as well? Or is it that we just don't deal with the ontological question at all?
Good question. As you've probably discovered in your podcasts, Marxology is a bottomless rabbit hole. Marx wrote over a long period of time. His thinking evolved in certain ways, although I don't accept this idea of the radical break or something. But his thinking did evolve over time. He thought in relation to his deep historical studies, but also in relation to unfolding events in his own moment. He wrote in a variety of registers, persuasive works that were delivered as lectures to workers, to kind of his extremely rich theoretical systemic analysis and historical analysis. It was both theoretical and historical in the 3 volumes of Capital. So this question of, I don't think, I mean, one can find certain quotes in the 1844 manuscripts when he's talking about species being and the kind of alienation of one's essential humanity, this line from the German ideology. But I think if we take, so, there's no upside and no winning in like the real Marx or the right Marx. But I think for me, Marx is a radically historicist thinker. Everything is social and historical. He is an anti-foundational thinker. He was against both metaphysics and positivism, two kinds of trans-historical thinking, two kinds of foundational thinking. There was no first metaphysical. If we take the totality of works and his most important kind of and most persuasive thinking, on the one hand, there is no first principle from which one could derive the truths of the world. And on the other hand, there's no, he doesn't discover positivist laws about human society as such that obtain in all times and all places. So I will counter your quote from the German ideology to what I think, I don't have it, this is the 6th thesis on Feuerbach, where he says the essence of the individual or the essential individual is the ensemble of social relations. And I think reading, I don't think there's an upside in reading Marx in an ontological way. I think we miss what is most whether Marx, whether we can marshal quotes to that effect or not, I would insist that he's on whole, Marx and the, kind of the most powerful Marxist readers of Marx and Marxist thinkers and Marxist militants that I have inspired me understand that this is not a foundational mode of thinking. This is not an ontological mode of thinking. Part of what he does is show the kind of historical specificity of all of these modes of thinking, modes of organizing social life, modes of producing and distributing goods as historically specific. I think it's more important. I think if we shift from the essence of the individual that will be rediscovered under or reclaimed under communism, I think for me, I tend to think of Marx as a thinker of alienation and disalienation. And alienation being all these ways in which whatever, regardless of what the essence of the human might be, regardless of whether there is a human nature. And he tells us that human nature changes historically over and over. So there's no human nature. But if we think about alienation and disalienation, whatever human nature is, this kind of capitalist organization of society is making it impossible for humans to whatever your notion of the human is to fully develop their inherited and acquired capacities. Human flourishing is impossible under capitalist social relations, not just a capitalist economy, but a capitalist, social order and world. And that the project is disalienation, which he also talks about in terms of human emancipation. So we could have a longer debate about how could he talk about human emancipation if he doesn't have an implicit notion of what the human is essentially, but I don't know. I invite us to move from the terrain of ontology to alienation and disalienation. I think that's more fruitful.
Okay, and then my final question then, do you see then utility in making the argument against those or with those who make the argument that, let's say, the USA is ontologically anti-black, or the world is structurally ontologically anti-black, metaphysically anti-black? Do you see then utility in making the argument that we can argue that but from a structural materialist position?
Look, no, I think analytically and politically that leads us into a dead end. What I do appreciate about thinkers who are making that kind of argument and generations, students and activists who are sympathetic to that argument is the insistence on the systemic racism. And we throw that around a lot, systemic. Most people in the kind of common media think like, yeah, it happens a lot. It keeps happening. No, it's not, it's much deeper than that. So I think the US, for example, is a fundamentally racist social order, an anti-black social order. And it was constituted such, but it was, so I think one can agree with the force, the insistence on the kind of the thoroughgoingness of the systemic racism that is constitutive of American social relations, American legal order, American consciousness, that as subjects, we are subjects of a racialized, racial formation, subjectivity at the deepest level. And I think this attention to libidinal economies and to kind of all kinds of processes and forces that reproduce this in a circular relationship with liberalism and capitalism is extremely important. But one doesn't need to make an ontological argument, because how would one even know such a thing? I mean, I am not sympathetic to metaphysical thinking, to positing, making claims about reality as such, or identifying first principles from which everything flows. That's, I don't know how you would know that's the case. And it certainly doesn't seem, I'm also interested in historical specificity. Stuart Hall, for example, insists on attending to the way in which race and racism articulates with a whole set of other ways of thinking, practices, social institutions, forms of domination to form these extremely powerful formations. Part of what the ontological kind of orientation also does in a very important way is to help us think about repetition and persistence. Look, it's not changing. Every single moment of promise of change, every single movement that sought to change the thing winds up reproducing the very conditions of anti-blackness, the very kind of racist order that it was supposed to fight against. But I don't think we have grounds, again, analytically or politically, for concluding that therefore it is what? In the structure of the human mind, it is, that anti-blackness is a kind of principle of history, an evolutionary, I don't know, but I do think we need to take the provocation and try to explain persistence and repetition and try to kind of, and they rightly also kind of question every kind of reformism. So the end of the world is the end of this world. It's a call for, it is the case that only a revolutionary transformation of American social relations could overcome racial capitalism. It's not going to be adjusted. So I don't know. That's the beginnings of an.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been an extremely interesting conversation for me, actually. And I just want to end,
And
actually, by
we're ending
reading
early. We're
a
just getting
line.
rolling.
I know I have to get you on again. But I did want to end by reading something from your preface, just to kind of leave the listeners with. In short, the current crisis offers a historic opportunity for a mass popular coalition of racialized, poor, precarious working people, along with other alienated and disenfranchised citizens, to come together in a moment for society transformation and popular democracy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's a treat to talk to you. And the few episodes I've listened to, like listening to your journey publicly, it's brave and it's exciting and it's inspiring. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Have a good day. Take care.
Take care.